I want to zero in on one thing here. So this concept of addiction and the reciprocal narrowing,
Yeah.
it's commonly fiat currency. I don't know if you're familiar with this term. So
No,
it's
not.
all of the money that's used in the world today is a product of central banking.
Right.
I'll try. It's a very deep rabbit hole in and unto itself. I'll try to give a brief history here. So gold was chosen by the distributed cognition of the free market as money historically.
Right. Yeah.
And it was chosen as money because it exhibits a number of properties, but one of the most important of which is an inflexible supply. So no matter how hard we tried to produce gold, of anything we try to produce in the world, we could increase its supply the least. Which is to say it's the most resistant to inflation. So if I hold my wealth in gold, I don't need to trust anyone in the world. No one can counterfeit gold. It's the most counterfeit. It's actually perfectly counterfeit resistant, but we could only increase its supply at say 2% per year based on its physical properties.
So diminishing returns sort of is that what you're saying? Like diminishing returns hit when you're trying to get more gold out of the ground and stuff like that? Is that?
Somewhat. So the real simple analogy with inflation is like, I use the Babe Ruth baseball card analogy. If there's 100 Babe Ruth baseball cards in the world, then each one has a value based on its scarcity or its supply, the demand exceeding its supply. But if you all of a sudden go and discover or can counterfeit more of those cards, you can dilute the value of the existing 100, right? If I can go and counterfeit 20 more, then I can effectively steal the value from the people that hold the other 100 cards. Does that make sense?
It does, but thank you. But I was asking about the first point. The supply of it is inflexible. So I see why it's resistant to counterfeiting. But I take it that gold is different from quartz, which is relatively easy to gather up together or something. I don't know if that's right or not, but I'm just using that.
Yeah.
So gold is somehow hard to get as a constant.
That's right. As a function of our time, because ultimately the economy is about our time, like how we're trying to create more outputs per unit of time input, essentially. But gold is the most inflexible commodity to increase the supply of. So no matter how hard we try, its supply increases the slowly and most predictably. So another way to say this, sorry, I'm getting so off track. It's the most inflation resistant money there's ever been. Right. So inflation is the dilution of money. So any rational economic actor is going to hold their money in gold because no one can debase its supply, if you will. Okay. The problem with gold as money is that it's gold. It's heavy. It's physical. It's hard to transact across space.
Yeah.
So a market function developed on top of it called warehousing. Right. Put all your gold in the warehouse. The warehouse will issue receipts, paper receipts that are redeemable for gold. So now all of a sudden we can transact it across space very easily. And at any time you can go and redeem the gold from the warehouse with the paper certificate. The problem there is that you now need to trust the warehouse custodian, right? If he issues more paper than he has gold in reserves, he's participating in a fraud. Right. And that became banking. That became central banking. Government's always commandeering this, centralizing it. And in 1971, we've gone on and off the gold standard throughout history, but the most recent one was 1971, where Nixon said no more redeemability for gold. So for the past 50 years, we've been on this fraudulent monetary standard where it's just paper, basically accepted and transacted in under the threat of coercion and violence from government. It's like you pay your taxes with this, you use this, there are no competitors to this technology. And that gives government an unlimited ability to confiscate wealth through inflation. So every time you hear printing money, a central bank printing money, what they're in fact doing is stealing from the productive economy. It's a shadow tax is what they call it. So long background there. On fiat currency is that. Fiat currency is money that cannot be redeemed for gold. So it's just
by fiat. I get it.
By fiat, exactly. Accepted by fiat. But many economists have analogized fiat currency and the expansion of its supply to addiction, actually. So once you start printing money, like say there's an economic contraction it's very easy to just go out and print money and kind of paper over the losses, right? There's an immediate stimulative gain, like kind of like a drug or an alcohol or anything else.
Right.
It gets the economy moving again, but it defers and exacerbates the long-term cost of that. You know, there's a cost associated with producing something for nothing, if you will, just printing money. And it leads to, over time, you need to print more and more money with each economic contraction. There's diminishing returns to the money printed, right? So there's less economic activity stoked per unit of money printed with each round of printing. And it ultimately culminates in hyperinflation. So like that's what's happening in Venezuela today. There's cash in the streets, cash in the gutters, wheelbarrows of cash. It's meaningless. It's lost its meaning. It doesn't serve its function as money. So I was just curious, this narrowing, reciprocal narrowing sounds a lot like the process of inflation, where it's like every time you print money, you're constricting your options. Like, you know, the money has less meaning, so it has less of an effect in the economy. And then it's working its way towards the inevitability of having to print even more money, right? Because you've damaged the economy again. So it's kind of like the alcoholic taking one more drink. He's that much more likely to take one more drink, even though it has a diminishing return on him. So
this is very interesting. So it sounds like, well, this is something I independently think is the case for theoretical scientific reason, but it sounds like you're saying something that converges, which is I'm not only interested in how individual cognition can be self-deceptive and self-destructive. I'm very interested in sort of what the opposite of the scientists on Mars are doing. I'm interested in how distributed cognition could also be self-deceptive and self-destructive.
Yes.
And we shouldn't assume that the intelligence of distributed cognition, I guess what you're calling the market, is classical. It's not. It's bounded. It has to be bounded. And therefore, it's going to be always threatened by self-deceptive, self-destructive tendencies. And so in addition to its intelligence, it needs to cultivate a collective rationality and perhaps even a collective wisdom in order to deal with the inherent tendencies towards self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior.
Yes.
Is that landing with you?
Yes. And I would say that is the pattern recurrent throughout history, is we abuse the money supply. Those in power monopolize and abuse the money supply until the integrity of the money supply is effectively broken. You go into a hyperinflation type event, and that presages civilizational collapse. Because if we consider that money, it's the medium through which we're engaging in trusted exchange with strangers, right? You make this point. That we're surrounded by strangers. Like, that's not normal. A lot of the reason we can hang out with strangers and go and conduct ourselves normally and peacefully is because the money works, right? If the money didn't work, you'd have a much harder time getting along with strangers, right? And you can see this in Venezuela. They're robbing their neighbors. They're eating cats and dogs. It's just, it's chaos, right? You regress to this.
Or the Weimar Republic in the 30s in Germany.
Yes, exactly. The Weimar Republic, exactly the same thing. So, and the wisdom there, I think, would be, and this is what I hope, this is why we have such high hopes for something like Bitcoin. It's almost like the integrity of the money supply and the integrity of civilization are inexorably linked. You break one, you break the other. And Bitcoin is the first money in history with a supply that cannot be changed. No one can change it. There's a lot of things to unpack there, but just take my word for now. There's 21 million. No one can change it. And it almost seems like perhaps it could be, to use your lingo, the wisdom that breaks this cycle of addiction we have to manipulating money. Something like that. Yeah.
Wow. That's a very profound proposal.